Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Amber Mace, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, and I'm pleased to welcome you to learn more about the study that we released today on the costs associated with wildfires in California. We have a lot to cover, and so I will just take a few moments to tell you a little bit about CCST as an organization and the study process, and direct you to our website because we have the full report there, the executive summary, and a one-pager. We will just be scratching the surface today of this over 200-page report. So I very much encourage you to go to our website to get more details. We are so grateful to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation who made this report possible, to all of the experts who contributed to this study. You're going to hear from a few of them today, though there are many others who participated, and to our whole CCST team. Next slide. And I encourage you throughout this process to think of your questions, add them to the chat feature, the Q&A feature, and we will get to as many of them as possible. The California Council on Science and Technology is a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created at the request of the legislature over 30 years ago to provide an independent source of science and technology advice to California decision makers in the legislature, the executive branch, and the governor's office. We do this because we have an incredible network of expertise in California. And California is so lucky to have so many amazing academic and research institutions, and CCST is truly lucky to have formal partnerships with all of the institutions listed here. We use these institutions as our partners and backbone of the network of experts that we tap into. They help us identify these experts within their institutions and beyond to inform the work that we do. And we provide science advice and technology advice to California decision makers through many avenues. You may know us for our Science and Technology Policy Fellows. We place 15 PhD scientists and engineers in the California legislature and executive branch each year for a year of government service and leadership training. We are saying farewell, thank you, and congratulations to our cohort this week who are just wrapping up their year of service. And we welcome a new cohort on Monday. We have a number of other ways to connect science and policy beyond the fellowship program. We host workshops, briefings like we're hosting today, and reports like we released today, where we can provide a deep dive into a particular topic. And we take this deep dive very seriously. So let me tell you just a little bit about our study process. So we have modeled our study process after the National Academies of Sciences, and we put together a team of experts that have a balance of experience and perspective. And we make sure that we do a deep look at potential conflicts of interest. We pulled together a whole set of other experts to do a rigorous peer review of this work to make sure that we can provide to the state credible, relevant, and useful information to inform policy. And this report that you're receiving today is based on data and information that is publicly available. It's existing information, so no new research was conducted to present these findings to you. This was really a look at what's out there and what's not out there, and that's what you're going to be hearing about today. We also rely on experts to pull in to talk to our study team throughout the process, in addition to the peer reviewers who contribute as well. And with that, I will very happily turn it over to our study team so that you can hear directly from them. One of the things I also want to mention about our process is that it is a consensus process. So Michael Wara is the chair of the steering committee, and the steering committee that he worked with, every single member agreed to all the findings, conclusions, and recommendations that you're going to hear today and that you'll find in the study. So Michael Wara is the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. So Michael, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Amber. I'll just lead off by seconding something that Amber said, which is that, and maybe adding to it, which is that the team that worked on this report has really done incredible work. the authors, the CCST staff, and the incredible group of steering committee members that contributed guidance and input have really kind of like gone beyond the norm, I think, in producing a really excellent report, and one that is, I think, among the most comprehensive surveys of wildfire impacts and strategies to reduce those that's been done anywhere, and certainly for the state of California. Next slide, please. So I think leading into the executive summary comments, I just think it's important to frame the conversation in the context we're in now. And I think these two images do a fair job of doing that. So I'm just going to briefly mention them. The image on the left is of the evacuation that occurred at Mammoth Pools in the early hours of the Creek Fire, as that fire blew up and burned with what has become all too familiar intensity over the last several years in California. But prior to that was really not part of normal, even unprecedented experience. And we're seeing fires burn in California, wildfires that are unrecognizable in their ferocity and intensity, and their rate of spread, in their destructiveness, both in terms of geographic scope and completeness. And they're causing much larger disruption to the state of California than really ever before. And that was a real motivator for the report. And also, I think, a motivator for the policy conversation that this report aims to be a part of. We need to be thinking about new policy, stronger policy to deal with the problem. And I think the figure on the right emphasizes this in a different way. This is a picture of purple air measurements from early September of 2020. And what it really shows is that wildfire is no longer a problem for just the people that live in rural parts of the state, in the WUI, within the burn perimeter of fires, that it's really a statewide problem, and significantly a statewide problem because of its incredibly large impacts on air quality. And we all experienced that living in California this summer, but it's not a new thing. And one of the aspects of this, one of the significant aspects of this, is that it makes the problem of wildfire not just a problem of the traditional stakeholders that have been concerned with land management or land use development in the WUI. It's really a problem for everyone, even if you live in the center of a densely built urban environment that's never going to be subject directly to a wildfire event. Next slide, please. So key takeaways from our report are really two. One, which is framed here in the negative, is that we can't currently provide a comprehensive cost estimate for wildfire. The costs are, and there are several reasons for that. A lot of that has to do with the fact that many costs are being measured but not systematically collated so that a statewide estimate can be created. Many of those measurements are being done in using differing methodologies. So you sort of get an apples to oranges problem when you try to figure out what the statewide impact in a particular sector is. That's one set of problems. Another set of problems is that some of the impacts that are becoming really significant are they're still developing science about how to measure them. And I think the most significant piece there that we make, and I'll talk about it a bit more in a second, relates to public health impacts and the impacts of smoke, where we're really now just beginning to measure this comprehensively, and so we can't currently include it in a cost estimate. Nevertheless, we can say with some confidence, and I think the steering committee would agree to a person on this issue, that we believe that the costs associated with some of these unquantified categories of wildfire losses, especially public health impacts, also loss of ecosystem services to the state, especially critical there is water quality and quantity impacts of wildfire, are in the billions, and that there's a high likelihood that they even exceed the costs that we can quantify, such as the cost of fire suppression, the cost of utility wildfire mitigation, and the cost of structure loss that has occurred in the state over the last several years, which, as we all know, have been unprecedented and really massive in scope. Next slide, please. A key take home that really emerges from the careful look that we took at the science is that the problem of wildfire is extremely complex. It's getting worse because of climate change, but it's also getting worse because of a variety of other factors, most notably just the fact that the population of California has grown tremendously over the last half century and continues to grow, and that the developed footprint of California is also increasing over time. Another point that we emphasize in the study is that good wildfire policy has to occur at the state level, but it also has to pay very close attention to regional context. The wildfire problem in Southern California is not the same as the wildfire problem in the Sierra Nevada, and those are not the same as the wildfire problem in the coastal mountains and the wine country. And we really need to be paying attention to these regional differences if we're going to effectively implement the best wildfire policy for the state. Next slide, please. So we do know something about costs, and the report does a great job of bringing together areas and summarizing areas where we understand the impacts. We believe that given the magnitude of the problem, it's worth investing in a better understanding of these costs. And the main reason is that if we don't actually have good cost numbers, it's very hard to develop cost effectiveness measures. And the reality is, as we all know, wildfire is one of many challenges the state is currently facing, and facing even as we get out of 2020 and everything that's been thrown at the state this year in particular. And there's always competition for resources. And so we need to make sure that every dollar spent on wildfire mitigation and prevention goes as far as it can. Without good cost estimates for these activities, it's very difficult to do that at this point. And so to develop good policy. Another place that we would emphasize where we just need more work done, and part of this is the apples to oranges problem that I mentioned, better collection of data that is comparable so that we can develop these systematic views. But part of it is also doing more and better data collection is in the ecosystem and natural resource values area, where we really face important challenges, as we all know, with respect to water in the state of California, and our water resources are fundamentally threatened by what is unfolding in the wildfire context. We don't have a great understanding yet of how the wildfire water nexus, and we need to start to develop one as a state, because this is a problem, as I said, that's not going to get better on its own because of the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Another point that the steering committee felt strongly about was the potential or the impact of housing development and the location and pattern of housing development and land use development as an explanation for structure loss in wildfire. The state needs to take greater steps, and we should say, I would say that we know enough to know that this is important, but there is not existing science that can tell us, what the best land use development patterns might be in high threat areas. And the state has a lot to gain from a better understanding of how land use planning and urban development can prevent structure loss and reduce ignitions in wildland areas. That's a point that we'd like to see further study on. Next slide, please. Another major conclusion of our report is that the public health impacts from wildfire are very substantial, but that we're not measuring most of them. We do know a lot about people that are injured or killed within the fire footprint because of burns or heat exposure, but we know very little about what appear to be widespread pulmonary and cardiovascular outcomes from smoke. And what we do know, and what we do under 2.5 exposure and the morbidity and mortality that that causes, is that there are likely to be both acute and long-term consequences, and that many, many more people are being impacted probably by smoke than they are by heat or burns. Um, we argue that much more effort needs to be made at the state level to systematically track these health outcomes. And that's especially true for vulnerable populations, outdoor workers, people that are living in older, less well-sealed housing. So we think that there are potentially significant equity issues that are raised by the problem of wildfire smoke and the air pollution impacts that it's causing at the state level. Next slide, please. So in terms of shaping better policy, we think there are good models for developing a more systematic and comprehensive data clearinghouse with respect to wildfire. And that could be a place where all the data that's currently being collected is housed. It could also play an important role in terms of standardizing data collection so that the data being collected is actually comparable. We point to Cal EnviroScreen and the Open and Transparent Water Data Platform as great examples in recent experience of where this kind of approach has been implemented, and we think that it's needed for wildfire, given the scope of the problem, given the scope of investment occurring in the wildfire space today. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our lead study author, Teresa, and she's going to talk through the chapters of the report and the conclusions therein. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. So I'm going to go over the conceptual framework and the scope of our report, as well as some of our findings with respect to the costs of wildfire losses. And then I'll turn it over to my co-author, Sam Evans, who'll talk about costs for related to prevention and mitigation. So as we're all becoming very familiar, wildfires and the related events that wildfires cause are complex natural disturbances that cause many outcomes to the state. Some of these outcomes are benefits and others are losses. And in response to wildfires, society invests in prevention and mitigation in an effort to reduce the losses and increase the benefits. And so when we talk about wildfire costs, we're referring to the dollar value of all of the losses, as well as the dollar value of all of the prevention and mitigation that we engage in to reduce those losses. So here's the scope of our report. Here are all of the categories of wildfire costs that we reviewed. And for each of these categories, we conducted a literature review looking at the peer-reviewed scientific literature, as well as reports and other publicly available data sets to determine if it's possible with the existing data to come up with a total cost estimate for the state. And as Michael mentioned, we don't quite have that yet with the available data, but we still know a lot. And in some cases, the categories that are colored green, we do have at least partial statewide tracking of the costs associated with these topics. But for most of the categories we looked at, and those are the ones that are in blue, we found, individual studies or individual reports estimating costs for, say, a particular wildfire, but the form or format of that data doesn't allow us to sort of add everything together to come up with the statewide total. So now I'm going to go over some of the more specific results we found with respect to the costs of wildfire losses, and good statewide data sets on costs from wildfires are important, again, not only to understand the scope and scale of wildfire impacts to the state, but comprehensive data sets are critical for running the cost effectiveness analysis we would like to be able to do in order to identify effective prevention and mitigation strategies for the state. So we took a look at 4 different major categories of wildfire losses. The first were losses to the built environment. So this would be destruction or damage of buildings and infrastructure. And here we found some of the best data tracked for California. So for example, with buildings, we have good tracking on structure losses and regular reporting of insured losses, as well as cleanup costs associated with particular wildfires. However, we don't have great data on uninsured or underinsured losses, which some evidence suggests could be equal to the insured losses in some cases. And so more research would be needed in order to get a better handle on these costs associated with wildfires. Next, we took a close look at health losses from wildfires. And again, we looked at not only the impacts from the wildfires themselves, but also the related wildfire events. So wildfire smoke, post-wildfire landslides, contamination, dust, and many others. And here we found that we do have tracking of direct injuries and fatalities from wildfires thanks to CAL FIRE. However, we don't have statewide tracking for most of the ways in which wildfires do impact public health, and in particular wildfire smoke. We also don't have statewide estimates of the health costs associated with these health losses. And this is probably the biggest area of our study that represents the biggest data gap for California. The studies that we have for California wildfires looking at the impacts of, say, wildfire smoke from an individual fire suggest that the wildfire smoke in many cases could be killing more people than the actual wildfire, and that the costs associated with these health losses could be easily in the billions or tens of billions of dollars. Next, we took a look at losses to ecosystem services. And so these would be clean water, carbon sequestration, clean air that ecosystems provide the state. And thanks to the implementation of AB 1504, we now have annual reporting on the impacts of wildfires to net sequestered carbon in the state. However, in general, for ecosystem services, we don't have a good handle on what these costs are, and primarily because we're actually missing a more fundamental data set, and that's just the dollar value of ecosystem services to begin with. So for example, here's a table from an attempt to value the losses from the 2013 Rim Fire. The gray boxes represent all of the ecosystem services that were impacted by the fire, and the fewer number of orange boxes are the services that had dollar values available for the researchers to estimate the losses. And so, there's just a lot of cases where we can't figure out the losses from wildfires because we don't have good valuation of the services to begin with. And our final category of ecosystem loss, wildfire losses were just economy-wide impacts, sectoral impacts to the labor, housing markets. And here we have preliminary data and some anecdotal evidence that wildfires can disrupt economic sectors. But critically, we would need new research on wildfires, and specifically California wildfires, to better understand the economic mechanisms and the long-lasting impacts that wildfires might have to economic activity. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who'll talk about prevention and mitigation.
Great, thank you, Teresa. So a second topic of costs that we reviewed in the report are the costs associated with wildfire prevention and mitigation activities. Prevention and mitigation costs are the investments that we need in order to prevent or reduce the losses of wildfire that Teresa was just talking about. The right balance of mitigation actions requires understanding two things: the costs of these actions and the effectiveness of these actions. And so we try to lay out our current understanding of both of these dimensions across a broad range of mitigation and prevention activities. Next slide, please. So prevention generally refers to actions taken to prevent wildfire ignitions, whereas mitigation refers to actions taken to reduce the losses from wildfire, if indeed a wildfire does occur. So we focused on two areas of prevention in the report. The first is programs and costs associated with public education programs to reduce human-caused ignitions. And then a second category we focused on was the industrial program investments to prevent wildfire ignitions from utility equipment. On the mitigation cost side, mitigation costs can accrue from a wide range of activities, covering activities in the built environment, the natural environment, the social environment, and the response environment. The built environment generally refers to the features of buildings, roads, infrastructure, and other physical assets that influence wildfire losses. The natural environment refers to fuels, weather, terrain, and other natural aspects of wildfire regimes that influence fire behavior. The primary area that we focused on in the report is the cost of various vegetation management strategies, such as fuel treatment and their effectiveness. A third category, the social environment, this generally refers to sort of all the cultural and behavioral components that impact fire, such as the laws we pass, policies, regulations that guide land use and planning decisions. And the final area of mitigation that we looked at was the response environment, and this includes wildfire suppression strategies, most notably firefighting. Next slide, please. So some of this information on costs and cost effectiveness we know very well, and the information is readily available and widely tracked. For example, on the left chart here, we see CAL FIRE's budget over the last several fiscal years. Just on the far right side, you'll see that this year CAL FIRE is expected to exceed $3 billion in suppression expenditures. This is just on wildfire suppression. On the right graph, you see the federal budget for all wildfire suppression costs in the entire United States, and that is also going up, and it's also about $3 billion a year. This includes some, well, probably a lot of expenditures in California. It's really important to note that we actually don't know how much the federal government spends on wildfire suppression in California. That data is not readily available to researchers. Other areas are also well documented. So from wildfire mitigation plans generated through a process overseen by the California Public Utility Commission, they document utility investments in prevention and mitigation, and that process has made a lot of progress over the last few years. There are other areas of mitigation where we found data and lots of information on cost effectiveness, but it's scattered across a whole bunch of different agencies at the local, state, and federal level, and it's not compiled into a single place that makes it easy to analyze. For example, we know there are numerous fuel treatment projects throughout the state, but there's no centralized repository tracking the costs and effectiveness of these activities. Other areas such as expenditures on the built environment and the effectiveness of these actions are much less comprehensively tracked and are often incurred outside of the government budgets by private citizens, making them even harder to track down. Next slide. Having this information on prevention and mitigation costs and effectiveness of these different strategies is really essential for effective planning and policy making. Despite the data gaps, it is apparent that investments in prevention and non-suppression mitigation activities is well below the state's suppression expenditures. Better tracking and analysis of mitigation efforts would lead to a rebalancing, we feel, of prevention, mitigation, and suppression activities that may improve the state's capacity to reduce losses from catastrophic wildfires. One possibility that we discuss in the report is setting target ratios for mitigation and suppression spending, similar to what FEMA does for its post-disaster spending. Yeah, thank you. Before we open up for questions, I want to reiterate a few broad takeaways from our report. It's really important to stress that there is an incredible amount of research and effort to track and understand the costs of wildfires in the state. So while we don't know everything, and we don't know the total costs, for some categories, with at least partial statewide estimates, shown in the green here, we know the costs are in the billions to tens of billions of dollars per year from wildfires in the state. And for the other categories where we have some data, but lack statewide systematic tracking, represented in blue, we can confidently conclude that many of these unquantified costs also likely exceed billions of dollars. So the main takeaway is that the next time you see a dollar value estimate of the cost of wildfire and you think to yourself, wow, that's a really big number, take a moment to ask what's included in this estimate, because it's likely that the losses left out of the calculation for lack of good data may more than double the reported costs. So I'm going to hand it back over to Michael to conclude.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. Sam and Teresa gave, is my video back? Well, Sam and Teresa gave a great, presentation of some of the key takeaways. And, I just want to conclude by saying that, over the last 4 years, California has experienced, truly catastrophic impacts from wildfire. And wildfire is not a new problem in the state. It's been around since Native Americans were here, before a European settlement, certainly in the WUI context since the 1960s and 70s. But the toll of human suffering and destruction wrought by recent fire seasons has really refocused concern on the problem and raised new possibilities for policy engagement and change within the state. Identifying beneficial policy change or new investments for improved wildfire management really requires knowing the costs of wildfire for the state. And this report has summarized the current state of science on what is known about these costs. Now, we conclude that we can't come up with an overall estimate, but I think this report does provide a really important framework that can be filled in future, and which provides a framework for understanding how to think about the cost of wildfire, and how to understand the numbers that we do know. We go into a lot of depth about what we know and also existing data gaps and opportunities for improved understanding. And I think this provides a framework and a jumping off point for the necessary public policy conversations around this issue. We're hopeful that with this report, stakeholders can proceed to prioritizing effective and actionable next research steps and also policy steps. And we're happy to address any questions you have about the report. Please use the Q&A function to send questions in. And I'm going to moderate questions and also direct them to Teresa and Sam as appropriate. So I'm going to start, Teresa, with a question, hopefully, with a question that came in about the public health costs. Just as someone would like to know, if we don't know what the uncounted public health costs are, how do you know that they're so large?
Thanks. Thanks for that. Yeah. So, what we found in our report is that we don't know the total statewide public health costs, but there has been quite a lot of research out there looking at individual wildfires or individual regions or wildfire events, and these studies have estimated the public health impacts of the wildfire smoke in terms of excess hospitalizations or fatalities, and then they estimate the costs associated with those impacts. And so we have calculations from individual fires that put these fires at billions of dollars, but there's a lot of fires out there that haven't been evaluated, and so we don't have the total statewide costs.
Thank you. Fran Pavley asked a question, did your report connect with the American Lung Association regarding the health impacts of wildfires? Teresa, do you want to take the I'd reframe it slightly, like how do we come to these conclusions about public health impacts?
Yeah, so the bulk of our research there was in the peer-reviewed literature, and so we looked for health studies that have been published looking at individual wildfires. There's an incredible amount of research out there, and we worked with experts in this field to collate, basically the most prominent research out there and pull it together. But there's a lot of interest in this area, a lot of organizations that are interested in this, and particularly since the smoke impacts have been so profound in the last couple of years. We're expecting a lot of new research coming out in the next couple of years, looking at, for example, the impacts of this year or the 2017, 2018 years.
I think that's a great, the one thing I would add is just to say that, what we're trying to do in this report is really pull the research together to be useful to the stakeholders that maybe haven't thought as much about wildfire in the past because it's not a sort of, traditional air pollution question. But when we spoke with experts on the issue and read the literature, we also realized that it can be really important as a stressor for populations that are vulnerable to air pollution in the state, like say kids in the San Joaquin Valley, and sort of be additive on top of that air pollution. And we had a steering committee member, Mary Prunicki, who's a real nationally recognized expert on these issues and is doing active research also on them. We had another question from Kimmery Wilshire, asking us to estimate some of the costs. She points to other reports from elsewhere in the American West that make an attempt to estimate costs. I would point to notably Headwaters Economics as one entity that's tried to estimate the full cost of wildfire. And why can't we do that? And I'll pass that to Sam and Teresa, and I may have a little bit to add at the end.
Okay, yeah, there are a few efforts out there, and they're quite interesting to read, and there's some really great quality information in there. And I say they take a good effort at sort of using secondary data to estimate the costs associated with specific wildfires, and they come up with a broader set of costs like we are thinking about in this report. They're still narrow a little bit because they are constrained by the same data gaps that we point out in the report. So they are more holistic than, say, an academic study that focuses on just the mortality or morbidity impacts of a single fire, right? So they're more holistic than that, but they're not comprehensive in the way that we sort of think that tracking of these costs should be. So I would say that they are an improvement, but there's still a lot that they're missing. And the things that they often miss, I think, have important policy implications, right? So if we have really good tracking of infrastructure losses, home losses, building losses, it really highlights the need to take mitigation actions to prevent those losses, right? But if we don't include comprehensive estimates of the healthcare costs, we may underinvest in mitigation actions such as fuels management and things like that that would prevent those losses downstream. But those reports are out there, and I would encourage everyone to go read them. There's a handful of them.
Teresa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, there's a lot of really great effort out there trying to estimate costs. But, all of these efforts, and we all run into the same issues with data gaps. And so, they're great efforts, and it's just important to pay attention to what was and wasn't included in any cost estimate that you see of a particular wildfire. The current state means that things have to be left out because the data is just not readily available. And we should be thinking very critically about what's being left out of these estimates and how much they might cost.
I might add to Sam and Teresa's excellent points, just to make this more concrete. We were asked about the costs related to the Camp Fire that occurred in Butte County and burned, most so destructively in Paradise. And I think this is a great example of where we know a lot about some costs. We know a lot about the insured structure loss, the death and injuries within the fire perimeter that occurred. But the Camp Fire also caused enormous smoke impacts across large parts of the state. And we don't know a lot about those costs. There's a lot of good research going on right now in Butte County with respect to the ecological impacts of the Camp Fire and the impacts on water resources and recovery, but we don't know, as Teresa pointed out earlier, quite how to value those impacts and make them more comparable and part of a public policy calculation about how much to spend to avoid these losses. And so those are the kinds of deficiencies that we're pointing out, and we think they're really important, and that the state of California is well poised to actually make a lot of progress in answering them, and so contribute to the to better policy outcomes. Fran Pavley asked a second question, which I think is worth touching on. She asks, could the external costs of wildfires and smoke that have been enhanced by a changing climate also be considered through the scoping plan update process, which is about to kick into gear this year at the Air Resources Board, or other climate-related policies? This might analyze both the mitigation and adaptation associated with wildfires. I think it's a great question. In general, the objective of this report and of CCST is to provide the best information to policymakers, and not necessarily to tell them what to do with that information. And so I think it is something for the Air Resources Board to consider. I know that the ARB has been actively working on response to wildfire, both in the Forest Management Task Force, the Forest Carbon Plan before that, and also in terms of facilitating prescribed fire over the last several years, and also in terms of better communication and solutions for individuals that are impacted by air pollution. So they're thinking about all of this. How to integrate it into planning about carbon emissions in the state is a question that I will leave to them, because they are the experts. Cody Warner asks, seems like a lot of research on wildfire smoke focuses on hospitalizations and mortality. How are you thinking about the cost of defensive investments related to wildfire smoke, like air purifiers, staying indoors, extra inhaler purchases, and so on? Teresa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And people are thinking about that. The things you named are basically the mitigation strategies for smoke. It's to stay indoors, to reduce activity when possible, run air purifiers, etc. These, of course, all have a cost. And there is some research that's been coming out in the last couple of years looking at what people are spending on these mitigations, and then also, how much of the public is able to implement these mitigations. And at least starting to get some cost-effective analyses as well to ask, is it worth it? Is running an air purifier worth it to offset the whole cost, and finding some promising results? And so, again, it's an area that's getting a lot of attention, and as sort of the academic literature has sort of a lag, and as it catches up, we expect a lot more research coming out. But there's a lot there, and it's this is also an area where, again, it's really important to consider the equity considerations for this. Who has jobs that allows them to come indoors when the air is bad, and who is still working outdoors, who can close the windows and run an air purifier, and stuff like that. And so, yeah, those are all really important considerations, and we're just starting to get a handle on how they're being implemented in the state.
I would just add to that I think there are interesting questions about the sort of feedback to Fran's earlier question concerning climate mitigation. If you can't open your windows because it's smoky outside and it's hot, you're more likely to invest in an air conditioning system, which is then going to feed into the challenges that the state has with managing electricity demand, or has had this summer, is working toward resolving, but it's going to make those challenges harder. And so there are kind of interesting interactions here between how mitigating impacts from smoke may complicate mitigating impacts from climate change. Let's see. George Paradas, hello George, says, asks, did any of the categories you considered include foregone activities such as travel, recreation, exercise? He's really asking a question about how broadly we're thinking about the both the direct and the indirect economic impacts of wildfire. I'm going to hand that to Sam to take.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. We have a whole chapter in the report on this, and we I think, catalog all the studies that we could find that point out both the how wildfires affect specific markets, thinking about how they affect agricultural markets, construction markets, which other ones did we look at? Forestry markets, recreation, that sort of stuff. And then we also catalog how they affect other markets, such as the housing market, different labor markets. There's some really interesting research that has come out in the last year or so, thinking about how wildfires affect labor markets in California. So we do a pretty deep dive on that literature. I think there's a couple of takeaways. One is the research is, I think, just starting in this area, and we have some sort of anecdotal evidence suggesting that some of those, indirect is one way to frame it, but they're direct to somebody. So those economic costs, so we think of them as like market mediated costs. They can be quite large, maybe on par with like the suppression expenditures in certain years. That's anecdotal from a few studies. So, we need more work to sort of confirm that. But yeah, we have a whole chapter on the report, chapter 7.
Eric DeCock from OPR asks a question about planning and land use development. He points out that we point in the report to housing development as one important factor explaining structure loss, and that the state, we suggest the state should evaluate land use planning and urban development as an alternative strategy for preventing structure loss, and wonders whether we quantified the scale of planning and regulatory compliance costs, CEQA, for updating plans and implementing plan scale solutions. Teresa, I'll give you that one.
Thanks, Michael. These are all really great points. What we found was very little information on actual costs associated with this. So, it's discussed in the literature. People recognize that land use planning, to potentially be quite impactful for mitigating wildfire losses, and that, there are various costs in terms, regulatory costs and planning costs that would be associated with that. But to some extent, this really hasn't been implemented at scale in the state. And so we didn't find any estimates of what those actual costs are or have been sort of realized in the state. So this was an area where we sort of had very little that we found.
I would just add that this issue, the steering committee certainly recognized in saying this, that this is all, wildfire is taking place, the problem of wildfire and planning issues raised by wildfire are taking place in a context of a housing crisis in California. And obviously, if you do something over here, it's going to have impacts over there in the big real estate market that is California. And we recognize this issue is complicated, and that context matters. Another question asks from John Curlin at University of the Pacific, any information on the impacts of prescribed burns, especially air quality, and what's the kind of risk trade-off versus wildfires, right? If prescribed burns create smoke, wildfires also create smoke. How should we think about that trade-off? Teresa.
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question, and one that's definitely top of mind of many. This is sort of a good example of why we need the good data on wildfire losses. It's presumed that because prescribed burns are done under controlled conditions, and one of them being controlling the smoke plume, only burning on days where that will be favorable, that, prescribed burns, will have a lower health impact than an uncontrolled wildfire. But again, without better tracking of the losses from wildfire smoke to begin with, it's hard to run those analyses right now. And so this is sort of the report finding that it's incredibly important to better track losses from wildfire smoke and the impacts of the prescribed fire so that we can ask these really great trade-off questions.
That's a great response. I would just add, I think that we are blessed in the state of California with one of the most scientifically advanced and capable air regulators in the world, maybe the most advanced air regulator in the world. And this is the kind of problem that ARB has shown themselves, capable of developing kind of comprehensive analysis on in the past. And I think the one thing that I think the steering committee felt very strongly is that, like, we have institutions in the state that are really best in class for dealing with this problem. The size and scale of the problem has really changed over the past 3 or 4 years, but we felt a lot of optimism and confidence that we could make significant progress. Johnny Mojica asks about a pretty specific question about FEMA and the role of FEMA in providing additional funding for essentially pre-disaster mitigation. So yes, FEMA preliminary damage assessments are directly tied to the amount of funding that comes to the state through their post-disaster assistance programs. How can this information be included in future damage assessments? Are we pushing for FEMA to include these costs in their damage assessments? So again, this is wading into policy, which we try to stay out of, but I'll just say that I know that Cal OES is working hard to establish programs to try to leverage FEMA dollars to the maximum extent that they are available to help reduce risk in the state. And it's an area that I expect that the state of California will continue to push. And it's consistent with the broader approach that FEMA is taking to trying to reduce risks rather than simply just pay, deal with the losses after a disaster strikes. Tony Marino asks, is the data problem a collection issue or a data management or standardization issue? Sam, what do you think? How would you respond to that?
I think it sort of depends on the data gap. I think the sort of good answer is that a lot of it is not a primary data collection issue, it's an organization issue, right? We have a lot of fire management agencies in California on the suppression side, on the planning side. They collect data, but we don't centralize that, right? So we don't have sort of a central repository, which is why one of the recommendations we made is that for certain types of cost estimates, we have a central repository that can facilitate sharing across different agencies and across local, state, and federal government. So I think for that data, for example, budget information on how much we invest in fuels management activities, right? That information is out there somewhere, and it's kept by specific agencies. So having a framework to sort of pull it all together, that would be sort of the primary objective for that one. There's other information where we just don't know, like private expenditures on home hardening costs, home hardening investments. Those are done in the private sector. Teresa was talking earlier about air purifiers. That's all done by private citizens. We would need to go out and collect that information. So we have major data gaps, just like we just don't know what those total expenditures look like. And it's both not centralized anywhere, and it's probably not even collected systematically. So I think it really depends on the category of costs that we're talking about. And we try in the report to sort of highlight the distinction between those two, the two types of gaps, right? Gaps in centralizing the information and gaps in primary data collection.
Thank you. Paul Mason asks, does the report get down to specific recommendations, for example, for mitigating smoke impacts on vulnerable populations, or are we more noting that it's an area to address and better quantify cost? Teresa.
It's the latter. And so, the report was meant to, look for the data out there to come up with cost estimates, and then also look for, what we know about cost effectiveness of prevention and mitigation. And so it's not meant to be a planning document. And so, we don't include recommendations for, how to buy down the losses of wildfires or which prevention or mitigation activities should be pursued by the state. But we do assess all of the, data and all of the research that we could find for many topics on the evidence that they are effective or that they're cost effective. And so we've pulled that data together, which could then be used to come up with plans moving forward.
I would just add that this gets at one of the most thorny conceptual difficulties with estimating the total cost of wildfire in California, because it depends a lot on how much you spend on various mitigation activities and then how effective those activities are. And so really the question to ask is what mix of mitigation activities and land use development and other activities, what is the output of that complex interaction of forces? And different mixtures are going to produce different levels of cost. Julia Pierpont asks, what about climate change? What are the effects of climate change on wildfire frequency, intensity, and geographic scope? Sam, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So we have a background chapter in the report that tries to lay out the current state of the science on the role of climate change in California for wildfires. I'll point you to that to go learn all the great research that's been done on this topic. I'll point out that it's sort of a multifaceted problem, right? Climate change is a contributing factor. Land management and fuels management is a contributing factor. Population growth and where the population is moving is also a contributing factor. And it really varies depending on what part of the state you're talking about. Are you talking about Southern California? Well, the role of climate change, we think, based on the current research, is going to be different there in the past and going forward than it is in, say, the northern part of the state or the Sierra Nevadas. So it's quite a complicated question. There's no doubt about it that climate change has played an important role in the past and will definitely play an important role in the future. And there's a lot of good research out there that I would suggest that you go read and to sort of understand all the nuances around California in sort of the degree to which climate change is attributed to wildfire activity. It's also important to point out that there's a bunch of different ways to measure quote unquote wildfire activity or wildfire regimes. And we also lay this out in the report. There's the number of wildfires, the size of the average wildfire, the intensity or the severity of the wildfire. And so it gets really complicated really quickly, and climate change is going to interact with all of those indicators in different ways.
Jim Boyd asks, your summary points out low expenditures on fire prevention in California. I would assume he means relative to expenditure on suppression. This echoes discussions within the wildfire task force, but also reports dating back many years. I remember I recently read a report written in 2005, chartered by Governor Schwarzenegger after the 2003 fires, making similar points. Will your report sufficiently point out this deficiency to today's policymakers? I would say that we do touch on this. And not so much in terms of that we should be rebalancing, but that given the scale of losses from wildfire, we are going to need to maintain the kind of world, best in class firefighting capability that the state has, probably build on that, unfortunately, but also consider dramatically increasing the degree to which we're investing in prevention and mitigation measures. The problem now is we don't have enough information to figure out what the right mix is. We suspect that that mix should be more, should include greater expenditure on prevention, and we think that that's something where we can't wait for more data, but it's also an area that also merits much greater study and research. So we're coming up against time, and I just want to ask for any closing thoughts from Sam, Teresa, and I just say again, thank you for your work on this report, and also thank you to the audience for all of the excellent questions today. Sam, Teresa, any last thoughts?
No, thank you, Michael. Thanks to everyone for joining. I would just encourage everyone to go read the report. And if there are researchers on the line, feel free to reach out to us. And please use this report as a roadmap for what we think are the important areas to sort of focus on in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo Sam's thoughts. Thank you all for being here today. And if you have any questions with the report, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
All right, well, thank you both. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Amber to conclude the briefing.
Thank you, Michael, Teresa, Sam. That was fantastic. And thanks again to all of you who joined us today. Do go to our website for the full report, like Sam said. And you asked wonderful questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all of them in this conversation. We are grateful that you asked them and that we hope that our researchers can follow up with some of you on them. And again, we're grateful to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for supporting this effort, all of the experts who contributed, even if they weren't on the screen today, and to all CCST staff. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.